Good morning, everybody. For everyone who's joining from the U.S., and good afternoon to everybody who is joining from other parts of the world. We'll be jumping into the webinar now. I apologize for the delay. Before we start the webinar, I just wanted to share a couple of quick logistical notes with everybody. So during this webinar, you'll be able to hear me and our presenters, but we will not be able to hear you. So we encourage you, if you have any questions or comments that you want to share, to use the questions pane on your screen. And we'll be using the second half of this webinar, about 20 to 30 minutes, to answer your questions. We'll also be uploading a couple of resources and handouts from our guest speakers. So we encourage you to download those handouts from the handouts tab of your screen. And finally, we wanted to let everybody know that the webinar is going to be recorded and posted to the PACE project and TRB websites, and we'll be sharing it through the African PHE newsletter. So now that that is out of the way, my name is Nita Gates, and I am a policy analyst at Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Elizabeth Gay, who is a policy analyst at PRB, and Bernard Anyango of the African Institute for Development Policy based in East Africa. So our topic today is connecting population health and environment approaches with youth and the demographic dividend. This webinar is part of the PACE project, which stands for Policy, Advocacy, and Communication Enhanced for Population and Reproductive Health. So Africa PHE quarterly webinars, which is what this is, are one way that the PACE project is working to support the PHE community of practice and increase commitment for multi-sectoral approaches that integrate population health, environment, and other sectors. Just as a reminder, you can stay engaged with the Africa PHE community in a couple of ways. First, we have the Africa PHE monthly newsletter. So it's emailed out to a mailing list towards the end of each month. And to sign up for that, you can email us at africaphe@prb.org. We also have the Africa PHE Twitter account, and as I stated earlier, these webinars take place once per quarter. So now I would like to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Bernard Anyango's work involves providing technical input in implementing knowledge translation and technical assistance projects to enhance the use of evidence in decision-making processes at national and regional levels. He joined APIDEF in 2014, and he has more than 6 years of extensive hands-on experience in demographic and health surveillance research with KEMRI and CDC research and public health collaboration. He has also served as a teaching assistant at Brown University in the U.S. He has a PhD and an MA in sociology and specializes in social demography and urban sociology. Our other guest speaker today is Elizabeth Gay, who is a senior policy analyst in the international programs at PRB. She leads the development of policy-focused workshops and events and synthesizes research on population, reproductive health, and economic outcomes into materials that can reach a policy audience. Before joining PRB, Elizabeth worked as a senior associate at the Reproductive Health Technologies Project, where she led advocacy efforts to improve the availability of and access to modern contraceptive methods in the U.S. Prior to that, she managed an international public health program at the U.S. Department of State. She holds a Master of Public Health and Health Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies. So many people tuning in today might be new to the population health and environment approach, so I'll quickly explain what it is. PHE programs integrate approaches that improve access to health services, especially family planning and reproductive health, while also helping communities to manage natural resources and conserve biodiversity and ecosystem elements that they depend on. PHE programs are customized to fit the needs of the communities in which they are implemented, but at their most basic level, they address family planning and reproductive health and other primary health needs. And this enables communities to be able to prioritize other challenges or needs, such as conservation, natural resource management, and other issues like sustainable livelihoods and food security, which are also tied to natural resource management. Human health and population dynamics and the environment interact in a lot of ways. So for example, people might depend on their local environment and natural resources for food or for timber, livelihoods, and in certain cases, rapid population growth, which is often driven by an unmet need for family planning, drives unsustainable environmental practices, which often also impacts health and economic outcomes, and places pressure on social sector services like education and healthcare. The PHE project basically recognizes and address family planning, reproductive health, and primary health needs. So, why PHE? PHE is an excellent way to help remote communities address their challenges. They improve equity by reaching hard-to-reach populations. They're community-driven, and so they respond to the needs of these communities that they're implemented in. Research has found that family planning and conservation are often received better when they are packaged together with other priority benefits of the community. PHE projects also increase the men's participation in health activities or health decisions and women's participation in natural resource management. And they've been shown to be cost-effective for the organizations that implement them and time-efficient for the communities where they're implemented. So I quickly wanted to talk about some PHE projects that are being implemented and discuss how they are working to reach young people, which is a critical component, as we'll learn, of the demographic dividend. So the first project that I wanted to talk about is DSW's Integrated Bonga Forest Project. The Bonga Forest Project, so DSW launched this project in 2001, and the purpose was to manage degraded forests, improve livelihood opportunities, and address unmet health needs of people who live in communities around the forest. So they worked with other local partners, educating the community on participatory forest management and on the socioeconomic benefits of protecting the forest, but also maintaining production and marketing of coffee products, which is a big economic driver in the area. So the way that DSW is working on this project also involves youth groups, and they have this model called the Youth to Youth Initiative, or Y2Y, and they support a network of youth clubs which provide peer education on issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights, also environmental protection, and they're also developing the business and leadership skills of these young club members. And the clubs engage in information and sensitization campaigns in the communities, and they also work with forest management groups. Some of the issues that are most relevant to young people also in terms of health is implementing youth-friendly adolescent reproductive health care services. And the project has already been demonstrated as scalable and replicable because it has already been replicated in multiple sites, this Y2Y initiative. I also wanted to bring up Jane Goodall Institute's peer education program, which is working in Uganda. So Uganda, in this area, has a high dropout rate for high school-aged girls. And so JGI is working through their peer education program to support young girls with scholastic and sanitary materials, and they receive instruction through a peer education model. So the trainers have to date provided individual mentoring to over 7,000 students in over 70 schools. Parents are sensitized on the needs for young girls to be educated, and the program has shown that over 600 girls who had initially dropped out of school have now returned to school. This program has also been replicated near a national park, and Jane Goodall Institute is working to spread it to new schools. but they are addressing a reproductive health need and also education specifically for girls. And finally, Pathfinder International with Partners institutes or implements the HoPE-LVB project, which stands for Health of People and Environment, Lake Victoria Basin. So this project is implemented in both Kenya and Uganda near Lake Victoria. And one of the components of this project, as a way to engage with young champions, the project has started working with young mothers and instituted a Young Mothers Club. And the young mothers are trained by HoPE-LVB, and then they go out into their community and they are involved in positive behaviors and messaging. So they do a range of activities from planting trees or talking to their peers and members of the community about sustainable fishing or family planning, or even things like using a skilled facility for birth. So young mothers act as champions in the community, and then also they are involved in household enterprises such as soap making or crafts, which are later sold. So those are just some ways that PHE projects are working with young people, but I wanted to talk about also some of the other challenges that other projects are addressing in addition to the needs of young people. So first, they're improving access to reproductive health information and health services, whether that access is knowledge or really just bringing facilities where there were none. They are improving or instituting improved environmental practices, and they're working to improve or diversify livelihoods. And both of those two factors together improve agriculture practices, they improve fishing practices, we're seeing reduced deforestation rates, and a lot of other improved environmental indicators. And we also see improved governance. So because these things are community driven, the community completely buys into them and makes them their own, in some cases establishing their own guidelines or laws and enforcing them. So these are some of the other elements of PHE programs that can also be critical to a demographic dividend concept. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Gay, who will be talking on the DD and reproductive health.
All right, thank you, Smita. Good morning, everyone, to everyone here in the U.S., and good afternoon to everyone on the other side of the world. I'm honored to speak with you today about the demographic dividend and its connection to reproductive health. So over the next few minutes, I'll cover the definition of the demographic dividend, policy investments required to achieve the demographic dividend, and the role of family planning and investing in youth. So the demographic dividend is increasingly part of development conversations, and many of you may have heard of it, but what exactly is it? The demographic dividend describes the accelerated economic growth that could result from a decline in a country's mortality and fertility and the subsequent change in the age structure of the population. Some people also describe this accelerated economic growth as an economic bonus. Reductions in the total fertility rate are critical for the demographic shift that precipitates a demographic dividend. With fewer births each year, a country's young dependent population grows smaller relative to the working age population. So this is what it looks like visually. On the left-hand side, we can see in Tunisia in the 1970s, there was a really young population with more dependent people relative to working age people. Between 1970 and the year 2000, 30 years, we see that their fertility rate decreased from 6.4 births per woman to 2.1, and under 5 mortality also decreased during this time. So that you have, in the year 2000, a larger working age population relative to a dependent population. And I do want to note that in the 1960s in Tunisia, there was an upscale and family planning program, And the National Tunisian Family Planning Program was formally established in 1968. So you can see that the shift was at least accompanied by some national level action to address total fertility rates. With fewer people to support, a country has a window of opportunity for rapid economic growth if the right social and economic policies and investments are made. And I highlighted social and economic policies and investments because of their importance. So here are two essential things to know about the demographic dividend. It begins with a change in age structure. Without this change in age structure, the dividend or economic bonus won't be realized. The second thing to note is that it requires proper investments in social and economic policy. Lowering fertility through family planning changes the size of the working age population so that it grows relative to the total population. And this means that there are more adults in the labor force per child and more resources available to families to invest in health, education, nutrition, and well-being of children. But the change in the age structure alone isn't enough. Strategic investments are critical. The demographic dividend doesn't happen on its own. So this graphic helps us visualize what it takes for a demographic dividend. It begins with the change in age structure, as I mentioned, on the left-hand side, which is brought on by the decline in total fertility. This creates a window of opportunity or enabling environment to invest more in the emerging generations. Nations earning a demographic dividend have invested in human capital of their populations, particularly in health and education, and they've implemented sound economic and governance policies. They've also sustained the political commitment necessary to make the most of the opportunity. When these investments are made, countries get a healthy, educated, and skilled workforce that can contribute to the growing economy that's supported through good governance and economic policies. And what I mean when I say good economic policies is that these policies result in more jobs, increases in trade and investment, increased productivity, better household wealth and savings, and they make better use of government resources, which makes the government more efficient and more able to invest that back into education and health of the population. So lowering fertility in order to change the age structure is the first step, but again, it's insufficient by itself to accelerate economic growth. This opportunity for accelerated economic growth, or the economic bonus, begins with and hinges on a smaller dependent population relative to working age population. And one of the key ways that we can accomplish this is to provide couples with access to quality, voluntary family planning, information and services so that they're able to have the number of children they want and space first for better health. One place to start is to meet the family planning needs of women and couples. This data from the United Nations shows us that there is an ongoing unmet need for family planning globally and in sub-Saharan Africa particularly. So among married women or coupled women, globally the unmet need for family planning is at about 12%. But when we take a closer look at sub-Saharan Africa, we see that approximately 1 in 4 women or couples has an unmet need for family planning. Another critical step is to invest in the sexual and reproductive health of youth. In order to initiate and sustain the population shift that has to occur to create this window of opportunity, there has to be attention to youth sexual and reproductive health, including their family planning needs. And I want to point out that the African Union heads of states and governments recognize that a country-level demographic dividend is central to the continent's economic transformation within the context of the African Union Agenda 2063, the AU's global strategy for socioeconomic transformation within the next 50 years. So in late 2016, PRB partnered with the African Union Commission to create a document outlining why investing in youth sexual and reproductive health is key and what types of investments policymakers should consider. The brief also covered how these investments contribute to larger goals of a more educated, productive, and economically stable population. This is one of the quotes from Agenda 2063 that's included in the brief. Africa's young people are the primary vehicle for realizing the demographic dividend and the principal engine for fostering development at all levels. So what happens when we invest in youth SRH? We know from the evidence that they stay healthy, they avoid unwanted pregnancy and childbearing, that we prevent sexually transmitted infections, including HIV, that youth are able to complete more years of school, and that they, by continuing their education, are able to obtain the skills necessary to be economically productive. Our brief with the African Union Commission made several recommendations, but I wanted to highlight a few key ones here. First, it's important to provide age-appropriate, culturally sensitive, and rights-based comprehensive sexuality education. Second, there's a need for youth-friendly sexual and reproductive health care that adolescents can access. And thirdly, it's important to help youth, especially girls, stay in school. I want to revisit the concept of youth-friendly, which means that youth can access the care they need in a way that meets their expectations and makes a positive contribution to their health. Providing sexual and reproductive health services in schools can make them more accessible and thus more youth-friendly. But it's also important to reach out to youth who are not in school. Research shows that proximity to youth-friendly care facilities and to condoms increases the likelihood that adolescents and youth use those services and enjoy a better health outcome. Investing in youth is a recipe for success. Interestingly, helping young people stay in school has a positive impact on their sexual and reproductive health and consequently on human capital. Education is shown to be a protective factor for many SRH and economic outcomes. Increased educational attainment is associated with delayed marriage, delayed childbearing, and reduced risk for HIV. Adolescents and youth with more years of school, especially secondary school, are more likely to develop the skills they need to be economically productive. So I encourage you all to read the brief that is provided as part of this webinar, and I want to point out some other resources as well. So the first two, Achieving the Demographic Dividend Report and Harnessing the Demographic Dividend video, are really foundational pieces to understanding this larger concept of a demographic dividend. The second two focus on youth and can help you get a better understanding of the role of youth and how youth are critical to demographic dividends specifically. So I want to thank you all for your time and attention, and I encourage you to check out these resources.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth. So with that, we will pass it on to Bernard.
Hello. What I'm going to do is to make a presentation that connects the population dynamics we are seeing, especially in Africa, with health and environment, and particularly go towards the end of my presentation on approaches to youth and the demographic dividend. So for my presentation, the background really gives some things on the AU theme of the year and the background on population dynamics, look at implications of population growth, and finally end with the PHE approaches to youth and the DD. So many of you might be aware, next week is going to be the 29th AU Summit between the 27th of June and the 4th of July to to 2017 in Addis Ababa, and the theme of the summit is harnessing the demographic dividend through investments in youth. And the big question is, why now? Of course, there have been a number of initiatives and stakeholders working around the demographic dividend who have worked very hard to bring this to the agenda of the AU, to the top of the agenda of the AU, because the theme of the year for 2017 is actually similar, harnessing the demographic dividend through investments in youth. But more importantly, it's about the population dynamics going on in Africa. So about 2/3 of the population in the continent is below 30 years of age, and this presents an opportunity to harness the demographic dividend. I think we've gone through a bit of the definition of the demographic dividend, but really that idea about benefiting from a temporary economic situation where you have a rise in the ratio of working age adults relative to young dependents, and we mean a significantly large working age adults proportion of people in the working ages relative to young dependents. So, but it's not automatic that when you have the bulge in the working ages, you harness the demographic dividend. It's important to have those investments in human capital development, creating jobs, and an environment that encourages the investments and savings that will actually spur the economy. So one of the things to point out is that even as we are thinking about the working age, the bulge in the working age, within the context of Africa, increasingly the term the youth bulge have become very popular in the discourse on the demographic dividend. And so again, it's just thinking about that bulge, but then referring to it as a youth bulge. And I think that the key thing to remember is that many of our countries in Africa are yet to really get to that working age bulge or even the youth bulge, because they still have a very large dependent population below the age of 15 because of the high fertility rates. But the important thing is if these births were to reduce significantly, then we can get the bulge, and this translates, the first year the youth bulge, and then this translates into the working age bulge, which will facilitate the demographic dividend. Let's go to the next slide, because I think this has been, So just looking at the population projections for the world regions over the next 50 or so years, you see that Africa is definitely going to be the fastest growing world region in this period, and the population, the total population in Africa is going to more than double from about 1.2 billion in 2015 to 3.3 billion. Overall, of course, Asia will still have the largest proportion of people in the world, but it's their population growth is sort of leveling off in comparison to Africa. Next. So the rapid rise in population in Africa, of course, is mainly as a result of high fertility. As you can see from this chart, while in Africa, on average, women expect during their reproductive lives to get about up to between 4 to 5 children, the next continent is at 0.42, which is Oceania. And we have seen in Europe it has gone below replacement level, and in Latin America and the Caribbean is just at about replacement level, similarly to Asia. So we know that the main contributor to the higher fertility in Africa is, of course, the lower usage of family planning, but also we also have education attainment in Africa, especially for women, is much lower. We know that this has an implication on fertility rates, but also their participation in the labor force and issues such as women empowerment, but also the high rates of child mortality contribute to this high fertility in Africa. So as a result, just comparing the population pyramid in Africa to, say, sub-regions such as Eastern Asia or Southeastern Asia, you can see that when we go back to the concept of a working age bulge, where we think of the working ages being between age 15 and age 64, you can see that Africa has the lowest proportion. This chart is showing estimates from 2015 at 56%, but it has a very large, it still has a very large young dependency burden at 41% of its total population. In comparison, Eastern Asia has more than two-thirds, both Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia have more than two-thirds of their population in the working ages. So they're really at the point where they can maximize on their demographic dividend. The other thing to note, just talking about Africa, but Africa is not a country. We know that there is quite a bit of variation in fertility rates in Africa, and as a result, the dependency burden is also very variable. What you're seeing there is a total dependency ratio. So that's the ratio of the population within the age of 0 to 14 and 65 plus. Relative to those in the working ages 15 to 64. So countries in Africa, you have countries, a few countries that have seen their fertility decline to below replacement, such as Mauritius, but also in the Southern Africa region, you have countries ranging between 2 and 3 children per woman, similarly to North Africa. But then in Middle Africa, they still quite high levels of fertility, and as a result, the dependency burden is very high. In a place like Uganda, where women on average are having 6 children per woman, you have a dependency ratio of 100 and above, and for some of the countries in the Sahel region. I think this, we've already talked, presenter earlier talked about unmet need and CPR, but I just wanted to show variation within some of the African countries. So if you can see this list of countries, you have contraceptive prevalence in a country like Malawi as high as 60%, almost 60%, but in South Sudan as low as just 4%. And when it comes to unmet need for modern family planning, you also have a huge variation. So you can see 32% in Burundi, for instance, compared to 17% in Kenya. So as a result of these high levels of fertility in the continent, the implications, and these affect all sectors. So the increased demand for basic services, especially for children, for education, schooling, health, so in terms of hospitals and so forth. But more importantly, there are also pressures on natural resources, including land, water, and these have implications for food and water and water security. There are huge demands, therefore, on livelihoods because of this rapid population growth in Africa. Just to show you an example from Malawi, looking at Malawi 1960, population density was at about 30 people per square kilometer. By 2020, it's estimated that this will have increased to about 170 people per square kilometer, and by 2050, almost doubling to 360 people per square kilometer. And of course, this has implications on the land resources that people derive their livelihoods from. Just getting a little bit more, some data from Malawi. So the agriculture sector most of the workforce in Malawi up to 85%, and this is actually true for most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You have very high proportion of the population in agriculture. So in Malawi, a study from 2014 shows that, a study from 2014 shows that maize dependency, with the maize dependency in the continent, and is happening alongside a decline in maize production because of global warming, so up to 40% estimated due to global warming. In 2013, 84% of rural households in Malawi, for instance, were food insecure for at least 1 month, and the country is also vulnerable to climate shocks. Drought in 2016 is estimated to have reduced GDP by around 2%. So just this particular slide is just showing you the stress, the population growth, and the connection between population growth and climate change in Africa, and we're calling this the climate change hotspot. And as you can see, most of the countries are affected. So in yellow, you have countries that have high population growth rates and high decline in agricultural production. Orange, you have high population growth rates and low resilience to climate change. And in red, you have the countries experiencing all three variables. And then you have countries that also, in addition, suffer water stress or scarcity, or suffer water stress or scarcity for the three variables above. What is important to note, though, as you have seen, is investment in family planning can have impact, positive impact when you look at it in connection with the climate change strategy. So we know that putting investments in both family planning and climate change strategies can reduce poverty by improving and expanding health, schooling, and economic opportunities. It protects and manage your natural resources for economic and social development, and this would reduce inequality and also create greater opportunities for the population. But despite this knowledge about the connection between population health and environment, we've identified barriers to integrating action, policy action in population health and environment. And these are the 5 key barriers. So there's weak coordination and governance mechanism for climate change in the continent, lack of climate change policies, or they're fragmented and conflicting. There's weak technical capacity within government agencies to show the benefits of integrating PHE and development goals. There is weak technical capacity in government agencies to design the integrated programs, and the lack of funding for developing and implementing integrated programs. So I wanted to just go back to the AU team. So the AU has the roadmap on harnessing the demographic dividend through investments in youth, which now the African countries are sort of adopting, and their strategies are revolving around this AU roadmap. But the key thing to note is that despite these connections we are showing between population health and environment, among the pillars within the AU roadmap, you don't see the environment and climate change focus. So the roadmap is based on these 4 pillars. For the first, employment and entrepreneurship, then education and skills development, health and well-being, and within health and well-being is where they've subsumed the family planning and reproductive and sexual health. And then you have the rights, governance, and youth empowerment. So this is one of the frameworks for harnessing the demographic dividend. There's the next framework that has also been quite popular within Africa, and it was developed in conjunction with the Population Reference Bureau. Next. the wheels of the demographic dividend were the demographic transition. To open up that window of opportunity, you have to see a decline in fertility, have the demographic transition, but then in addition, invest in education, health, governance, economic reforms, and job creation to get the demographic dividend. And many countries have actually been working around this particular framework. But again, I think missing there is the climate and environment components. So we are proposing that, climate and environment change have to be a major pillar in conceptual frameworks to harness the demographic dividend. So you have your change in the age structure leading to more people in the working ages, and then you have the policy, legislation, and investment actions to harness the demographic dividend when you have that change in age structure. But then the pillars, in addition to human capital development, economic empowerment and job creation, and governance, climate and environment change have to be in that equation for people to actually think about maximizing their demographic dividend in view of what we are seeing, the dynamics in climate change, the dynamics in environmental degradation. But also importantly, I think we have an opportunity to make sure that the climate and environment change does not fall off the development discourse by also linking this to the sustainable development goals, which luckily for us, I think has a very strong component looking into climate and environment change. And looking at the three frameworks I've shown you, including what we are suggesting as in the last slide that is now showing, to make sure that climate and environment change is really part of this conversation if we are to maximize on the demographic dividend. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bernard. That was a great presentation. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. We're getting a couple of questions also through the questions pane, but I would encourage everybody to continue asking any questions that you might have using the questions panel. So there was a question that came in on, so you mentioned that climate and environment are missing from within the AU roadmap. So are there any processes or opportunities now or moving forward to get environment inserted into this strategy?
So yes, so I think that the good thing is that the rest of the year is still dedicated to the theme of the demographic dividend, including the upcoming meeting, and these are spaces for deliberation where people can push the agenda for making sure that we don't leave climate and environment change behind. But I think, again, just as I pointed out at the end, many countries are also still in the process of domesticating the sustainable development goals. And I think that is an opportunity because from my experience working in the continent, the demographic dividend is now being brought into the agenda, including for domesticating the sustainable development goals. So the demographic dividend is being brought in there. So this is an opportunity to link the two, the demographic dividend, the sustainable development goals, and of course sustainable development in general, and bringing in the PHE angle to the discourse.
Great. And then there was a question that came in about a map that you had. So the question was just kind of asking for elaboration on what makes a climate change hotspot.
So this is an analysis of countries where we are calling it a hotspot because we are saying, one, On the one hand, you have the high population growth rate, and you're looking at what these implications are. So there are countries like the countries in yellow are having both high population growth rate and decline in agricultural production. And part of that decline in agricultural production is coming through the fact that as you have more pressure on land, there's also greater environmental degradation that is happening. Okay, you have high population growth rate and the countries in orange, and low resilience to climate change. So countries like Mozambique. So the number one thing, their strategies, even in terms of, remember when we were talking about the barriers, what are the strategies or the policies in place for dealing with climate change? The more frequent cycles of flooding, for instance, more frequent cycles of drought. And if these mechanisms or policies are not in place, then you have low resilience to dealing with that climate change. But also you have the issue of water stress and scarcity, which is now a key issue affecting quite a number of African countries. If you for watchers of the Southern Africa region, actually the last 2 years, I think this year has been a good year, but the Southern Africa region have really been suffering from a prolonged period of low rainfall and actually drought. So this is what makes if you have that happening, but at the same time you have this very fast rising population numbers, then you have to come up with a strategy to deal with a PHE strategy, really, to make sure that you can move on with sustainable development.
Great. Another question that came in was on results of the DD. So this person is asking, is there an evaluation for any country where the demographic dividend has actually resulted and you can see the advantages for the country?
Okay. I mean, the studies, the analysis that have been done that really put the agenda of the demographic dividend on the map of the East Asian countries, where we saw very fast decline in fertility between the 1970s and 2000. But in addition to that, it was not just about changing the age structure for them. They also invested heavily in human capital and in job creation strategies. But I think what is important for African countries is not just, because the question usually is, what can you say about that the context of the East Asian countries might differ very much from the African countries. But I think if you look at some of the countries with fairly good development indicators in Africa relative to in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll also see that there is a connection with that change in the population age structure. The Southern Africa region, for instance, the Mokassin declined to lower levels of fertility than, say, Middle Africa. Of course, they're grappling with the issue of the unemployment of young people, but I think there are lessons to be learned from there. And there are also countries like Mauritius, where you can also, where other countries, African countries, Mauritius, Seychelles, you can draw lessons in terms of what are they doing in terms of governance, what are they doing in terms of making sure that they're diversifying their economy. So it's really a multi-sectoral approach, and rather than that always having to hark back to the East Asian countries, I think there's also an opportunity to learn lessons from African countries that have undergone the demographic transition, both for what they have achieved and for what they could have done better if they had invested in the other pillars of the demographic dividend earlier, including the human capital, than is the case now, because now they're likely to harness a smaller magnitude, the magnitude of their dividend will be much smaller than it would have been if this plans had been put in place early enough. So for countries that are having TFR at 5 and can oversee swift decline in fertility over the next decade or two, the time to invest is now.
Thank you. So we have a question coming from a young advocate, a young DD advocate who was part of an advisory group to produce a video in Kenya on youth and the demographic dividend. And so this person has noted that there's been some resistance from religious groups on comprehensive sexual education, or CSE, and has questions about how people are going about resolving that. So I will just take that question really quickly, which is that PRB has worked with faith leaders to talk to them about family planning and how family planning can align with what different religions say. And so about how family planning doesn't necessarily contradict religious texts or beliefs. There is an engaged presentation that PRB produced a few years ago called Faith and Family Planning. And so I think a lot of, to answer your question, Alex, a lot of it comes down to messaging and how we talk about family planning, or what the benefits are for allowing young people to have this kind of control over their bodies. There's time for, I think, one more question. So this comes from an evaluation professional who works in planning, demography, and natural resource management. So he says that he finds, Bernard, your model to be very innovative. And so he's asking, per your model, what do you expect as a tangible deliverable? And do you expect your model yields to show how these objectives are realized with time? I don't think I fully understood that question, but.
Yeah, well, thank you for the compliment. But what I'd say is that we are, in the continent of Africa, are at a point where we are looking for very practical ways of implementing this conceptual frameworks. And so there's a whole agenda, and that is part of what we at Affidep are doing. There's a whole agenda about trying to find, going beyond the kind of evidence synthesis and research that has been done around the demographic dividend, to being able to support governments in practical ways on costing interventions, and on also being able to evaluate the impact of these interventions going forward. So really, for me, I look at it as the next frontier for the demographic dividend agenda in Africa, because I think people, policymakers have bought into the paradigm, and what they're looking for are really the practical ways and being able to do cost and benefit analysis about the interventions that would help them to maximize their demographic dividend.
Great. We have time for one more question, Bernard, which also I think you're best positioned to answer. So the question is from someone in Ghana who's asking, is there any data or evidence that clearly shows if investments in climate will contribute or directly lead to its demographic dividends? Or I guess, is this more theoretical right now?
Well, it's I wouldn't say it's entirely theoretical, because again, when you're talking about the demographic dividend, it has many parts to it, and like we have seen, and if you're to follow on the PHE projects around the world, then you definitely see there are benefits that come with the PHE projects or the PHE approach that will obviously lead to larger demographic dividends or But I think that the key thing is most of these projects are not yet in large scale, and maybe that's the next area for PHE and the demographic dividend as we scale up these projects to be able to evaluate their positive impact on population and development.
Great. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining the webinar today. As a reminder, this will be posted online, and if you're on the Africa PHE listserv, this will be disseminated through that email also. So thank you so much, Bernard and Elizabeth, who had to step out early, for joining us today, and thank you again to all of our viewers.